When I first saw Gunfu Fighter, I expected a sort of puzzle-based FPS. Since I've never actually played Superhot and have only heard of it and seen gameplay footage of it, I can't fully compare Gunfu Fighter to it. I still feel that it's fair to say that Gunfu Fighter is pretty much a Superhot clone. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but seeing as how I did have a number of issues with GF, I don't think people that played Superhot and enjoyed it will want to play what can be viewed as a lesser version of it. I realize that's a pretty rough way to start a review, but seeing as how I have mixed feelings towards GF, I might as well. From the start, the enemy models left me wanting more than what I got. Stick figure enemies is nothing new and I'm sure that they'll continue to be used, but at one point it got old fighting the same looking enemies over and over again. I enjoyed fighting against stick figures in Stick Def, a true blast from the past, but what makes things different between GF and Stick Def is that in the latter, the experience isn't as long as in GF. GF took me nearly 6 hours to beat, and from what I vaguely remember, Stick Def was around 2 or 3 hours long. It also doesn't help that GF doesn't have many moments where it gives you a break from the sameness of gunning down stick figures. Based on how things turned out with the enemies, it left me thinking that they were an afterthought, and that the focal point of GF was its levels, something I'll eventually get into. All of the enemies in GF weren't completely horrible, but due to how the majority of them are, it's worth discussing. The fact that I could easily mow them down as a result of utilizing cheesy tactics shows that you could run circles around them. When it comes to the enemies and the tactics they utilize, the mentality is less is more, and it's like facing waves of cannon fodder. Thanks to how some of the levels were designed, I could corral a large number of enemies into a tight staircase and just mow them down without having to worry about being overwhelmed. The fact that I could change things up this way shows that it isn't as closed off as I'm making it out to be, but a handful of interesting moments doesn't make up for what's largely an okay game. It was towards the middle of GF that things started to change up, and it was thanks to the addition of a different enemy type. They were still stick figures, but they were larger, more vicious, and they'd even attack their own kind. I thought that was great because I'm a big fan of turning enemies against each other. It's not only because it amuses me, but also because it opens the door to utilizing more strategy-based tactics. There was one level in particular where it was clear that the odds were meant to be stacked against you. There were numerous of these berserker stick figures, but alongside them were the general enemies. This level could be dealt with in multiple ways, one of them involving eliminating the general stick figures first, but the possibility to be overwhelmed was too great for that. It didn't take too long for me to figure out that I could release the berserker stick figures, open the doors to the larger areas of this level, and lead the berserkers to the general enemies. After the majority of them were taken care of, I pretty much just had to mop up whatever was left. The general stick figures would manage to take out one or more of the berserkers, but not to the point where they'd all be taken out. Due to that, I couldn't be as hands-off as I was in some of the other levels. I know I've been painting a pretty grim-looking image of GF, mainly because I do think that it was a rough game to get through, but there were moments that stood out to me and left me thinking that had it offered a tighter experience rather than one that tried to cover all bases, the result would have been a better game. Every once in a while, GF would throw new things in, and it was cool that they could be used offensively or defensively. What I'm referring to is the fact that some levels had destructible boxes and some that were indestructible. The former really stood out to me because destroying them led to creating a sort of barrier between you and enemies. It obstructed your view and theirs at the same time, but even if this was only for a brief amount of time, I liked that this was possible. With the indestructible boxes, it was a bit different. You could use them as a more secure cover, but you could also kick them into the air, which resulted in some amusing visuals thanks to the physics system in the game. I realize that's a small detail, but as I've brought up in some of my previous reviews, I like when small details add to a game's enjoyment. It was like that with other areas of the game, but as I've already mentioned more than once, there was more that disappointed me. I know that despite generally sticking to mainstays of the genre, some FPS games usually stray from what's been previously done to spice things up. Unfortunately, with GF I would have liked had it stuck to the basics when it comes to its weapons system. More specifically, GF's lack of the ability to be able to easily switch weapons. With how many weapons there were in some levels, you'd think that you should be able to carry more than one. Whether it be something like Half-Life's inventory system or a weapon wheel like in the modern Doom games. I would have preferred something more like that than what GF had to offer. You could easily drop and pick up different weapons, but I didn't like that. It felt too limiting to me, and rather than thinking that it added to the overall experience, I thought that it took away from it. It's because it felt too repetitive using up all of the ammo I had, dropping the gun, and then looking for whichever was closest to me. The fact that I could sometimes choose between a knife, shotgun, machine gun, rocket, or pistol leaves me pleased with the variety of weapons, but I'm still left asking myself, why was there a barrier placed here? I don't mean a literal one, but I'm sure you can understand what I'm getting at. GF is largely a fast-paced FPS where you can instantly be taken out by one bullet. You'd think that there'd be little to no barriers between you and fast gameplay. I know that changing the pace of a game makes things more interesting, but I thought that this created a disconnect between how the game wanted to be perceived versus how it turned out to be. On the bright side, I like the weapons models. It's one of the reasons why GF stood out to me in the first place, mainly because of the strong contrast between the deep redness of the weapons and the largely white environments you were in. Besides what I've been discussing up to this point, one of the reasons why I was drawn to GF in the first place was because it mentioned that its level design was AI assisted. I'm sure that there are all kinds of opinions in regards to the use of AI in games and other creative mediums, but seeing as how the current state of AI really interests me, I figured I'd be getting a taste of what's likely to come within the foreseeable future. The idea of playing through levels that may have been partially generated thanks to AI is interesting, but in GF, the execution wasn't as good as it could have been. In regards to this topic, one of the first thoughts I had was, what's the point of using AI to help generate levels when a great deal of them can be beat in less than a minute? Because I felt that I really didn't get to fully enjoy what they had to offer. The solution would have been to make them longer and more interesting. That did occur in multiple levels, but for the most part, some levels were just square-shaped rooms with objects thrown in to spice things up. Seeing as how GF nearly has 60 levels and things don't drastically change from one to the next, it's easy to see how uninteresting some of the levels could be. If the levels weren't small and uninteresting, sometimes they'd be large, but with big empty spaces taking up a decent chunk of the space. I felt this way for the majority of GF's levels, but there were a few that stood out to me for specific reasons. There were some that made use of large houses and their verticality to spice things up. Rather than feeling as if I was gunning down stick figures in what was close to being an empty football field, I felt more stimulated. It wasn't just because there was a lot to explore, but also because I was more on edge. Through my initial run of these levels, I didn't know which room would have one or more enemies. At the same time, I didn't know how my gunfire would cause the enemies to react. Sometimes I could take advantage of the situation and corral them like I mentioned before, but other times I'd really have to think about which room I'd hunker down in to be able to defend myself and have an available exit just in case. Those were some of my favorite levels simply because they had more to offer. I realize that a game has to offer different things in order to avoid coming off as bland or overutilizing something, but as I've been saying, GF could have handled this differently. How the levels were arranged from beginning to end reminded me of how bands will arrange their album's tracks in a specific way. Some bands want to hit you hard from the beginning, whereas others want to gently give you a push that starts to feel more forceful as time passes. With how the levels in GF were arranged, I felt that more time could have gone into this part of the game. The first half of the game delivers what you would expect, mainly since you're just getting your feet wet, but from the middle towards the end, the experience didn't feel as well organized as it could have been. I would have liked to have had a more curated experience from beginning to end, but that wasn't the case. These levels felt randomly thrown in place and I didn't like that. Some were short and to the point whereas sometimes the next would feel like a marathon. That was especially annoying to deal with because they all stuck to the same mindset despite being different from one another. What I mean is that there's a big difference between a level that's short and difficult versus one that's drawn out and middle of the road in regards to the difficulty. Since all it takes is one bullet to kill you, it was easy to be taken out by what could be considered a sucker punch. Sometimes I'd spend more time than I would have liked roaming through levels hoping to get a glimpse of the remaining enemies, or sometimes enemy, in order to advance to the next level. Instead, I'd be unexpectedly taken out and I'd have to start right from the beginning. I didn't feel that GF was a hard game, but it was for sure a hassle to go through. At times I felt that the game was fighting against me, but in the wrong kind of way. Difficulty in games is something that's regularly discussed amongst gamers. From what I've seen, it seems that most prefer fair challenges that create difficulty as a result of higher enemy abilities instead of just giving them a bigger health bar. This wasn't an issue at all when it came to GF's general enemies, but it definitely was when it came to the bosses. Thankfully, there weren't that many. I liked the designs of the bosses because they greatly differed from the general enemies, but what bothered me was how long the battles would take due to them being bullet sponges. Rather than feeling like the right kind of challenge, I felt like I was stuck with tedious busywork. It was helpful that GF would tell you what to aim for, both explicitly and implicitly, but that still didn't help when you were firing away and seeing the health bar slowly drain. By this point, it should be clear that I don't recommend Gunfu Fighter. There were moments where I was enjoying myself and interested in what it momentarily had to offer, but for the most part, it was a rough game to go through. I do, however, think that GF could be improved upon in multiple different ways, and that'd lead to a better experience. I don't see that happening in the form of an update, but if a sequel's planned, I'd prefer a tighter experience that's had its excess fat trimmed off. Do you look on the bright side and try to find the positives of what's largely a rough game? Would you like more games to utilize current AI systems to assist with game development? What are your thoughts when it comes to level arrangement? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.